This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Charles Athanasopoulos, who teaches in the Department of African American and African Studies at Ohio State University. He is the author of a number of scholarly pieces on politics and Black cultural life, as well as the book Black Iconoclasm, Public Symbols, Racial Progress in Post-Ferguson America. In this conversation, we discuss the role of rhetorical traditions in Black studies, iconic figures and moments in Black history and culture, and the various expressions of Blackness and Black life in the political work of liberation struggle. Good morning, Charles. How are you doing today?
Good morning, John. I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. Winter weather here in Maryland has pretty much broken, so we've gone from this brutally ice-cold wind to 55 degrees and sunny, so I look forward to having no attendance for the week in class. But we are, and I keep saying it at the beginning of these, entering into the second month of a far-right government, so all caveats in place, things are going well. But I also am reminded in these moments, why these kind of conversations are important. It's just really good to be reminded of things that matter. So I appreciate you making the time to be on the podcast. Really interested to hear you talk about Black studies and your work for lots of reasons, for the series, for sort of taking stock of the field, but also in these moments of crisis for contributing your voice to things that really matter.
Yeah, I feel you on the weather. We keep jumping between like 9 degrees and 40 degrees, and of course, there's the renewed attacks on education in Ohio. But with all that said, I'm glad that you're doing all right, and I'm keeping it pushing, and I'm excited for our conversation today.
Well, that's the least we can do is keep pushing and stay committed to things that matter. And so hopefully this is a contribution to those sorts of things in your world as well. So we'll talk about your work and sort of your vision of the field of Black studies, but I wanted to start really with a more personal question and just ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? Intellectual, personal, sort of invitation to a narrative of how you got to this study and got to this field. And for me, always the companion question to that of what keeps you committed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, up until now, my scholarship has really been focused on this concept that I call Black iconoclasm, and my journey to that concept was quite personal, and I think something that wasn't even very conscious for a long time. But so I'll start by saying there are a couple of questions that I try to answer, and then I can sort of narrate how I came to those questions. And so first I'm thinking, how does this concept of Black iconoclasm unsettle discourses of racial progress in the post-Ferguson era? How does Black iconoclasm unsettle iconic narratives around the Black Lives Matter movement? From there, what use does the language of iconography and iconoclasm have for theories of Black study? And how does Black studies disorder traditional approaches to iconoclasm studies? And so this really started, I think, from when I was a young kid, being Afro-Puerto Rican and Greek Roma. I grew up in a Greek Orthodox church, and that church, if you've ever been to an Orthodox church, it's sort of riddled with icons. Everywhere you go, there's sort of these symbols showing you or bringing to life the biblical stories, right? And so for me, I grew up with that, and there was a point around high school where I came to realize that that racial iconography, both the particular symbols, the visual depictions, but also the conceptual one, right? The ideas of angels and demons and the proper life, that wasn't just strictly religious, it was also cultural, it was also racial. And so I actually narrate this in my project as going to a Greek Orthodox school, which you want to talk about educational indoctrination. And there was a time where I had to go to a forced confession, a mandatory confession. And I sort of had this conversation with the priest about feeling that there was a sort of contradiction, like, why am I praising these white men who were hermits in the Middle Ages over working class Afro-Puerto Rican and Greek women like my mother, right? That she seemed more saintly to me than one of those figures, and to him that was blasphemy. And of course, this was the same priest who was teaching us that Greeks should not intermarry across different races and cultures, even as I was in the room, right? And so I had this sharp break with Orthodox Christianity from there. And so when I got to college, I was really interested in thinking about Blackness and race, but there was no Black studies or ethnic studies at Wake Forest University at that time. And so my friend Joe was a religious studies major, and he told me that they had a reputation for talking about race and gender and sexuality in class. And so I paradoxically found myself in a study of religion department, and my advisor Ron Neal was sort of thinking about whiteness as a religion, right? So at the same time, I was minoring in writing. I think I was in the first graduating class of that minor at Wake, and then I was in women, gender, and sexuality studies. And so I'm thinking about race, religion, gender, and sexuality, and I'm also on a debate scholarship at the time, which is usually housed in communication studies programs. And so while debate was a predominantly white activity, I did find some important mentors there, like Rashad, Shanera, and Daryl, in terms of how I approach Black studies. So that's kind of how I had race, religion, gender, rhetoric, all kind of connected there. And then I ended up going to grad school for a combined MA and PhD in rhetoric and communication at the University of Pittsburgh. And that's where I was, it just came to me one day, this idea of Black iconoclasm. And I spent all of grad school really exploring that concept, and some formative moments were this 2019 course in Black rhetorics with Lou Mirage, and then another course in 2020 with R.A. Judy called Black Critique and the Black Radical Tradition. And actually both of those were in the English department, which was sort of my second home as a grad student when I was at Pitt, because again, the Black Studies grad program at Pitt really didn't take off until I was already in grad school. And so that was like, it never really was an option for me. Because I partially went to Pittsburgh to be in grad school where my partner was, and sort of kind of restricted the options for applying. And so in the backdrop of all of this is the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, thinking Trayvon Martin. That was when I was in high school. Right before I got to college in August, I hear about Michael Brown. I watch these uprisings happen. I see what happens in Baltimore in 2015. Alicia Garza comes to my campus at some point. And so I get to see her talk with Bree Newsome about pulling down the Confederate flag in South Carolina. And so I'm thinking about the original iteration, how it's suppressed, its evolution and resurfacing, and then the way that it's co-opted and adopted by mainstream liberals. And so that's sort of where I'm thinking at, both personally in my young adulthood and theoretically.
Yeah. So just as a side note, just want to over Riverside.fm bond over shared Romani roots. So Hungary, or formerly Ottoman Empire at the time, for my family. But and it's so interesting to hear you talk about this, because I did wonder, not wonder, but I thought to myself, I wonder if this, if your work in iconoclasm, was just sort of ironically, connected to your Greek last name. And I didn't, of course, had no idea that you had done Greek Orthodox church and schooling, but I know just how powerful that notion of iconography and iconoclasm is in the Greek Orthodox tradition and parts of the Catholic tradition, but much more Greek Orthodox. And so that's such a phenomenally complex but also unexpected, you finding you finding what you wanted around questions of race in religion after that story about religious education. It's a great chapter for a memoir, so keep that
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
pocket.
And I think part of how I also understood iconography in terms of race had to do in large part. Um, the cultural iconography of Greece is very much right. There's the Greek Europeans, the European migrants, the internal foreigner of the Roma. You have Arabic refugees, and then the African migrants, and that sort of scaffolds, and
Mhm.
the way that race is understood there. And so, being part of these two massively hated populations across the globe kind of made it apparent to me in my schooling that I didn't fit within whatever notion of iconography they were establishing. I actually just interviewed to become I believe it was accepted recently, to become a fellow in the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, actually. And so I'm really excited. Part of the second project that I'm doing is really thinking about the Afro-Caribbean experience and Roma Mediterranean experience through Glissant's idea of archipelagization.
Mhm.
Um, because he has some lines about like Roma people being an example of
Yeah.
like errantry. And so I kind of want to take them up on the meeting point of the Antilles and the Mediterranean. So that's what I'm working on in the next couple of years in relation to icons.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Glissant is such an interesting figure for exactly that work because, as you said, he mentions it. But and it's I love that Black Studies has been able to be a place where this cluster of concerns actually has real sustenance and real meaning. And I want to hear a little bit about your relationship to Black Studies and the tradition in a moment. But maybe before we get into that and talking about your work in relation to the field, I actually just want to ask you how you see the field, how you imagine it. What's your portrait of Black Studies? And I always want to ask this question in relationship to its origin story, because its origin story is twofold, or a sort of tension, right? One is the demand by students for a place to study the Black intellectual and expressive traditions, right? That university campuses and disciplines had no place for the study of Black life. And that's what Black studies departments were going to make possible. But in the same moment, the late 1960s and early 1970s, of course, was a moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, where some of those distinctions between classroom and community, between politics and study had really collapsed. And Black studies was also that demand to have study, to have intellectual work be essentially political, to be prescriptive, to intervene in these Black liberation struggles. And although that was 50 something years ago, I think it's something that really lurks in our conversations about what Black studies is and what it ought to be. I think one of the most important Black studies question is, what is Black studies, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm wanted to ask you in terms of your portrait, like what is the portrait of Black studies that you work with when you think about the field, um, and especially in relationship to this fraught or tense origin story?
Yeah. So, paradoxically, I imagine Black studies as something which at its core is anti-portrait. It is born of Black iconoclasm. It is, and by that I mean sort of throwing into crisis both the actual public symbols that are offered to us in the New World, but also the conceptual value system of race, gender, class, sexuality, etc. Which is to say that Black study is born out of a conceptual unmooring both of Western man, but also to dismantle its arbitrary disciplinary silos. Thinking with scholars like Moten, you could sort of argue that Black study has existed alongside the creation of the New World from its very roots, pre its institutionalization as a discipline, right? In the sense that Black thought is thought, and Western man is anti-thought. It's trying to constrict that sociality. So like I'm teaching a global Black cultural movements course right now. Actually, it's the class I just came from, and I started the semester by reminding my students that Black studies, in this iteration of it at least, across the nation and at Ohio State specifically, is born of student protests. So and that like there were actual demands made here at Ohio State. And at the same time, as R.A. Judy and Sylvia Winter have pointed out, the institutionalization of Black studies, often signified by the shift in name to African American and African studies, is real. Judy and Winter both point to the rhetorician Henry Louis Gates Jr. for how he attempts to frame African American studies as a kind of counter canon to Eurocentric literary canons, and that in doing so, it decontextualizes Black studies from its political struggle toward reifying Eurocentric modes of historiography and knowledge production, trying to mimic these disciplines. So actually, one of my colleagues here at Ohio State, Dr. Lupenga Mpande, pointed junior faculty in my department to this 1985 article when we first got here called "The Struggle for Control of Black Studies at OSU." And it actually reflects that the name Black Studies was shifted to African American and African Studies here because of concerns about Black Studies being too political in nature, isolating other members in the faculty and the student body, and actually concerns about reverse discrimination. And all of that sort of was part of this impetus to shift towards a more politically neutral form of Black studies. And so then Black Studies becomes a subsection of the humanities and social sciences rather than undoing the very epistemological structure subtending the university, right? And that's what Winter calls mistaking the territory for the map, or what I call mistaking the icon for liberation. And so this is the push and pull that I think we find ourselves in Black Studies. I imagine that this push toward a politically neutral form of African American studies will continue to re-intensify, especially with this sort of conservative backlash. Here in Ohio, we have SB 1, which is trying to prohibit DEI. But all of this is to say, when I reference the Black radical tradition in my own work and in Black iconoclasm, I mean it in a very broad way. It is to reference an open and evolving form of study dedicated to throwing into crisis the very fabrics of the United States and Western knowledge production. And so I can say that I approach it through particular scholars, primarily Frantz Fanon, Edward Glissant, Sylvia Winter, Hortense Spillers. These are generally the people I find myself thinking with. But I by no means want to assert my particular trajectory or perspective as the canon of Black radical study. I feel like it's important to understand it as this open and expansive thing.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a fantastic framing and reframing of it, and I mean we are in a weird moment where I think some of these divisions between political prescription and expressive the study of expressive and intellectual traditions itself, that distinction itself has collapsed. We're just simply studying Black life. It has become a deeply political act. And I know this is the language of the far right, but it's divisive, right? And it feels it's created this inexplicably a division. Somehow these courses where we can't get the students to read or turn in their papers on time is, now the gravest threat to all of humanity. But we have to think beyond these kinds of demands and moments, and really, I think ask this question that you sort of came to at the end, which is, how do we think about Black studies and a portrait of Black studies that has a standard to it, a standardization, right, a distinctiveness about it, and its plurality, because the tradition itself is so pluralistic, and how to think those things at once. I think you really put it well there, especially at the end of what concerns you and what are those boundaries. I think is always going to be a question for the field, and like all questions that question the very meaning of something, it's gonna be tense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just like anything, Black studies as a discipline it within it manifests Black radical excess. And at the same time, there are residues of the thing that we're trying to escape. And it's important to sort of build a practice of Black radical discernment where we can always have a sort of humble self-reflection in that manner about how those residues continue to infect the work that we're trying to do. I think right now the conversation will likely be pulled between these two dialectical icons, right? The conservative backlash that wants to completely rid us of Black studies departments, and then the sort of liberal compromised sanitization of Black studies that articulates it as a valuable, diverse tradition within the canonical humanities. And I worry that within that framing, we sort of lose the iconoclastic roots of the tradition that cannot be contained. It exceeds both of those things. And so, how do we find ways to defend the existence of Black studies without betraying some of the ethical principles that many of us as scholars and teachers profess to have?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, let me follow that then with asking a little bit about your work. You've talked about it a bit, you draw from rhetorical studies, political history, from cultural theory. And there's so many insights to be gained from this collage for the field of Black studies and for the study of Black life. And so I'm interested to hear you reflecting on the kinds of things you bring to the field and the kind of work you're doing, and ask you, how do you see it as fitting in the tradition of Black studies that's in its sixth decade? But also, what boundaries or horizons do you see it pushing and opening up?
Yeah, so I would situate my work in terms of like methodologically how I approach Black study, as sort of extending from that basic position of Black studies unmoors the traditional methods or siloing of disciplines within the Western canon. And so I'm thinking here with Christina Sharp that there is an impetus to unlearn certain modes of scholarship. But of course, there's a conversation happening around that in Black studies. So I know Catherine McKittrick has this idea of Black method, which is to say, sure, there is some undisciplining happening, but Black method also is a precise sort of gathering of texts and thinking across cultural arenas. But there is a sort of method to the madness, if you want to put it that way. And so within that, I'm trying to break the sort of silos between rhetoric, cultural studies, Black studies, etc. But I think that I also try to attend to the various cultural arenas that I analyze within their context and give full treatment to whatever object I'm analyzing. And in particular, I really deploy Lou Mirage's notion of what's called Black intercontextual readings, right? So it's the idea that you read seemingly disparate cultural arenas together. So I know Mirage talks about this and sort of like, for example, connecting a Black Lives Matter rally to a song that comments on BLM, like All Right from To Pimp a Butterfly, and connecting that to pedagogical spaces like the BLM syllabus, right? So you see the connection between activism, pop culture, and pedagogical spaces through a Black intercontextual reading. And so I think that allows me really to cut across these demands for only study public address, only analyze autoethnography, only look at film. I like to cut across those things. And so actually, in my book, Black Iconoclasm, I do this, the second chapter is about activism. I'm giving full treatment to the fractures around the BLM movement within the moniker, right? The next chapter is doing a full treatment of Fanonian theory and the various contemporary readings of it. The next one shifts to speech and communication, to think, what is a Fanonian slip? How does that happen in the interpersonal, political, and internal? I then look at films. How do we sort of engage in a praxis of decipherment, a la Winter, of the messages that we're getting across various films in post-Ferguson culture? And then what can we get in terms of street art? So I look at Black Lives Matter graffiti and street art through Glissant's notion of a poetics of relation. So I'm thinking of that graffiti wall as a poetics of visual relation. And then I even include a three-part short fictional story in the project called Black Icarus, right? And so it functions as a parable about how we sort of approach Black liberation or Black flight from the conceptual resources of the very labyrinth that imprisons us. And so really my work is eclectic in that way. It is eschewing those boundaries that perhaps more traditionalists or purists of disciplinaries might, sort of snide at. But I think that that's an important practice of undisciplining, while also showing that Black intercontextual readings can connect these seemingly disparate things. And I think that it also connects to this work of connecting the personal and the political. I feel like a lot of my writing is very much like oscillating between personal stories, political context, right? The actual rhetorical artifact that I'm analyzing. I think all of those are sort of connected to these scholars that I've been reading. Fanon and Glissant have their plays and their fiction, right? They talk about their personal lives, right? I think about the Combahee River Collective and Audre Lorde, and thinking about the personal as political. I'm thinking about Winter and Spillers, kind of thinking about symbols and rhetoric and how that creates an idea of Black culture. And sort of trying to build on that from my post-Ferguson vantage point.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you've already responded to this, because I'm interested. This intercontextual reading both obviously comes out of or is connected to, in terms of disciplines and other fields, is connected to your PhD being, as you said, in communications, and also just rhetorical theory. So I'm interested in hearing you talk. Maybe you say, refer to the last few minutes, but maybe hear you talk a little bit more about how that kind of training, which I know communications is multidisciplinary in many ways, but it does have its own methods that are distinctive to it. And so I'm always interested, for those of us who were trained in disciplines and then end up in Black studies, what that relationship between disciplinary training and non-disciplinary work life, right? And I mean work life in terms of teaching, but also in terms of writing. How that transition what that transition has meant for you, as a writer and as a teacher, into area studies out of a discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, even from high school, working with my mentor Rashad Evans, I feel like I was always approaching things from Black study. Like, I always imagined myself from the very beginning going to college as doing a form of Black study, and it was just like, I have to do it in these other places, whether because of like where I had to go to grad school or the non-existence of Black studies programs. And so from the moment that I entered my MA and PhD program, I always was sort of like, listen, I'll do what I gotta do to prove to you that I am a rhetorician, but like, for me, I was always at odds with the impetus to be a purist practitioner of communication and rhetoric. And within that, all of these disputes amongst the rhetoricians versus the media studies people, right? Versus the cultural studies, like, they have these silos within the silos of the disciplines. And we can even see that in English, the literaturists versus the rhetorician literacy people versus the narrative folklore people, right? I was always in my mind like, I'm going to take what I can from this field insofar as it helps enhance my form of Black study, right? And so I felt like there was a sort of like a feeling of like suffocation in very moments as a student and as a professor, where it was like forwarded to me like, you have to forward your communication or rhetoric identity first and fit in how Black study matters to that inquiry. And so this transition to Black studies has really, I feel, been freeing, right? Where it's like, I'm like, the course is no longer argument, it's global Black cultural movements, intro to Caribbean literature. And so I feel like that fullness I've really appreciated. But I will say that what rhetoric offers me is a full treatment of a rhetorical artifact, something in popular culture, a rhetorical text, media, giving it a full treatment. Just paying attention to the specificity of the language, the visual symbolism, what it's being born out of in a cultural context. I think in my undergraduate days, I was really used to forwarding a structural theory. I was really into like Fanon, Afro-pessimism, Moten in undergrad. So I found myself forwarding a structural theory in a very top-heavy way, and 85% of the time, and then doing like, only a little bit of contextualization to the specifics. And so the rhetoric training really allowed me to say, no, let me start from the thing that I'm analyzing and draw out the specifics and then connect it to whatever structural perspectives I may have. And so I feel like it also allowed me to really think about connecting cultural arenas, as I've mentioned, right? Activism, literary theory, film and media, visual rhetoric, But at the same time, rhetoric is really bound up in Eurocentric models of Western knowledge production. It is at the very sort of narrated origin story of the Western academe, right? So I was like taught from the beginning that the OG beef was, Plato versus Aristotle, right? Philosophy versus rhetoric. Is it just about capital R reason and truth versus rhetoric as persuasion, right? But in that, so I never really wanted to be beholden to that. But what it did allow me is a sort of to veer into, and I think, many scholars are familiar with semiotics, but generally the idea that symbols are arbitrary representations of things, that language is not objective. It is a filter for something that is out there. And thus we manipulate those symbols in a way that can feed power, or we can manipulate those symbols to undo, to unmoor, right? To create a different sense of community. And I think that very much comes out in the way that I think about the manifestations of icons in popular culture, the way that they rhetorically act on subjects to venerate particular social codes, and the way that Black radical thought and activism sort of suspends those things and has us think about its insidious contents and imagine an open space for new possibilities without prescribing what those possibilities are. And I think rhetoric was important for me in that way. The writing training was important, just like actually for the practice of writing. But I've always felt it important to position that beyond any institutionalized discipline, what I do is a form of Black study that should not be beholden to some like purist understanding of how we do scholarship.
If I could follow up then to, what then is that Black? How do you anchor that sense of Black study? Because I hear a few different things. Maybe it's just all of them combined, but there's the kinds of questions that Black studies asks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's also Black study in the sense of forms of knowing which are distinct and different, but also Black studies as anchored or related to a series of texts that are touchstones, that are exemplary, however one might want to characterize it.
So one place that I'd start with is, the Fanonian concept of sociogeny, the social production of values, to me is very much connected and filters my engagement with the idea of man as a symbol using animal, to quote Kenneth Burke, or thinking through semiotics. So when I think through those rhetorical concepts, I'm really thinking, well, how is Western man socially produced, arbitrary, imposing itself, right? And then how can we, on the everyday level of the messiness of lived experience, how can we throw those into crisis? How can we antagonize them and refuse them? In terms of forms of knowing, a lot of the times this is connected very much to the rhetorical understanding of like the rhetor, which is imagined as this rational speaker interacting with an equal democratic, like other that they're trying to persuade. And so often rhetoric and communication has this notion of rational dialogue leads to mutual recognition, right? And that's that sort of Socratic line of thinking that even people like Hegel take up, right? This idea of the sort of self-thinking thought, right? The constant progression from Lord Bondsman to universal citizenship through rational dialogue. And I very much approach that from a Fanonian perspective. Anti-Black and colonial violence is the meeting of two oppositional forces. There is no mutual dialogue to be had, right? It does not come, decolonization does not come about by a friendly gentleman's agreement, as Fanon says. And so that kind of unmoors that Western perspective. It also means approaching autoethnography differently from the traditional Bildungsroman narrative that is sort of, I, the European subject, narrating my journey to enlightenment, right? But instead actually engaging in a form of Black autoethnography, and I'm engaging Mirage here as well, that says, well, how do we actually use that to dismantle, to take the European subject off of a pedestal, right? To narrate from what Fanon calls the nepa, the nowhere of or nothingness of Blackness. And those are just a few ways that I can think of from now. And I guess the sort of training in visual rhetoric really is filtered by symbols of racial progress, representations of Blackness. So I'm thinking about films and street art as manifestations of activism, Black activism, but also liberal co-option.
I love that. Thank you. No, that was really fantastic response. Super thoughtful. Um, so let me actually just make a kind of a big shift. Although I think you've you've played at the edges of this question already in really interesting ways, because I think it grows out of what the way you were describing, the sort of insurgent sense of Black study in relation to the Western tradition, the white Western tradition. And so I want to ask you about the field of Black studies and, looking at its 5+ decades of work. What do you think Black studies has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
And so this question is a complex one, right? Especially when I consider my perspective of Black iconoclasm. I tend to try and stray away from marking out a particular camp versus another camp and saying, well, they're doing it well and you're not doing it well. But what I can say is that I think that Black studies and just any form of Black study is at its best when it is disordering, when it is breaking molds, when it is opening space for things that are not neatly defined, when it recognizes that some things will be opaque to us, but that there is a larger process that is still worth committing to. I think that Black studies is at its worst when it's trying to mimic other disciplines, to fit within other molds, to legitimate itself within the Western Academy. And within that, I think even if it's not about legitimating it within the Western Academy, I think sometimes we risk mimicking those disciplines when we try to create closed canons with strict originalist interpretations of whatever theorist or concept it might be, right? So this is something I think about with Fanon. There are all these competing interpretations and uses of Fanon, and a lot of them are claiming to be the originalist, the proper. There's pieces literally titled Authentic Fanonism, right? And so I think that there is a risk, though, when we try to assert a formula of Black liberation, or to assert this is the only way to interpret this thing. I kind of think of it as sort of like trying to capture a lightning bug in a jar in the attempt to marvel at its beauty, but in doing so, we quite literally suffocate the thing that animates the lightning. And so we can have our perspectives on things, but I think it's important that our conversations continue to be from a perspective of humility, of self-reflexiveness, and an openness to sort of undoing even the established commandments that we have of Black liberation.
Yeah, I mean, you're really touching on a thing that's been a very common thread across a lot of these podcasts, which is, how does Black studies have an identity as a field? Which is necessary. I mean, we can't just, otherwise we're completely vulnerable to, why aren't you just in a communications department and study Black life, or philosophy department? So there's something distinctive about Black studies, but how do you manage that sense of identity or distinctiveness with the proliferation of possibilities? Because some disciplines don't do the proliferation of differences very well. Some really do. I mean, I'm partly in the English department. I know you are as well. English departments at this point are in a very productive way, like very chaotic. It's where you have film scholars, it's where you have cultural studies, you have critical theory, you have rhetoricians, you have writing instruction, and old-fashioned literary criticism, brand new literary criticism, everything in between. And I do think it's interesting to reflect on how the field does and does not have places where these conversations happen regularly. I think Black Studies has struggled to have journals that are committed to the field rather than to a particular aspect of the field, to have an organization that's not a sort of subset of a larger organization. And, sort of how do we work those things out over the coming decades, I think is going to be such an interesting way of negotiating what you're talking about in terms of being disordering. How do you disorder in a shared space, in a shared something? Yeah. Well, we have to exist as departments. That may be,
Right.
this is February 2025. This may be a really material, urgent question, but managing that diffuse kind of sensibility with our distinctiveness. I think you put it really well, just in terms of the question we have to ask ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in some ways, this gets to the heart of this next question I had for you, which is less about looking back and thinking about the past of the field and sort of what it's done well and has not done well, and more a sort of futurist question. And when you mentioned McKittrick's, idea of a black method or black methods, one of the things that strikes me about this question of black methods, or the question of what makes us distinct but also different, is really what would the sign of our success as a field actually be in the future? Would it be to have so transformed these disciplines that the challenges and the study of Black life are central to them? I mean, I think some fields are unrecognizable today in relation to what they were before Black studies, English and history departments in particular. Is that the sort of success of our field, is to transform the entire university through the study of Black life and to return that to the disciplines and their transformation? Or is the ultimate success of Black studies to develop a really robust sense of our competing, internal to the field, competing methods, competing sensibilities, that real sense of unity, such that we can't be distributed back into disciplines, however transformed those disciplines might be? And I think this is really important in terms of our imagination of the field, because this latter sense is, the sort of eternity of Black studies, the eternal life of it in higher education and in scholarship. The other is, maybe Black studies is here in order to do its work toward no longer being, to have transformed the university in ways that it has begun in corners. But I am always struck by how we don't have really extensive volumes on, what is the Black studies methodology and debates around that. So we struggle with that sense of our distinctiveness that would say something about our future as a success.
Yeah, I sort of think that the past, present, and future of Black studies are knotted together by some continual questions. What constitutes Black liberation? What are some basic political principles and ethical tenets of Black study? And how do we discern Black radical excess from the co-options of Western man? Right. So as I've hinted to, for me, from a Black iconoclastic perspective, it's about approaching Black study as un programme de désordre absolu, or a program of complete disorder in Fanon's words. Right. So there's the general sense that really the role of Black study then is to help usher in the end of the anti-Black world. It's a demand that Frank Wilderson describes in Afro-pessimism as too iconoclastic for reformist and humanist political narratives. And the hope is that such an orientation open space for new forms of study, animating what Moten would call the carnival alternative of Black social life. And so I'm also thinking with Glissant about this idea of chaos monde, or anti-system thought, right? Which is to say, I think I understand Black study from my perspective as kind of holding us in a liminal space of disorder, a space where we cannot cling to any icons of the current world, reformist, right, or of future ones. We don't necessarily have a clear idea of what comes after. And so this is why Fanon really emphasizes this notion of tabula rasa, right? Scraping clean of the tablet. And so for me, that's less of a temporal moment of like a purity yet to come, but instead a continual practice of Black radical discernment, where we're constantly scraping clean the tablet, right? Of how we think about Black study. And I think that is what makes us distinct from these Western forms of study that are really looking to establish a very clear systemic understanding of their methods and ideology. I find us as sort of stuck between the present imperfect, the anti-Black world, but also the future imperfect, the call for that thing beyond it. And I think the key to it is really imagining Black studies as a negative theology, which means the refusal to assert a teleological blueprint of Black liberation, or to make sort of positivist declarations of what a Black world looks like. That there is a space between mimicry and strict formulas of Black study. There's something in between there, right? That I think that is where Black studies sort of threatens the project of Western man the most, because it goes against the desire for epistemological certainty, for transparency, right? And so, insofar as academic departments exist and the university functions as it does in a pragmatic sense, yes, I agree that I would like Black studies departments to exist. Insofar as we are thinking about the role of Black study, I do believe it is to transform not only the university structure, where the very concept of distinguishing disciplines in their silos perhaps is thrown into crisis, but really I don't think we would be imagining the kind of American society in which we live in as the basis for that, right? That there's something larger that it's pushing to, a sort of abolitionist perspective. So I think that the answer is kind of yes to all of them. It does mean arguing for the necessity of Black studies as a department without sort of betraying our ethical principles in the short term. I think it does mean that Black studies transforms other disciplines by the nature of its arguments and the way that it undisciplines traditional methods, but it also is looking to push for something that is outside of the very terms by which we usually approach these conversations, right? So this again kind of brings me back to Black Icarus. It is a parable thinking about Black flight, right? Daedalus, the father of Icarus, is the one who actually makes the labyrinth, right, in the ancient Greek myth, and then he ends up being imprisoned in his very creation, right? And I reimagine this story to say, like, thinking of Icarus as the sort of Black child of Daedalus, right? Because in the ancient Greek myth, he actually is married to someone who Daedalus is married to someone who's enslaved, right? So I'm sort of adjusting the setting here and really thinking, like, even when Daedalus is trying to get away from the labyrinth, the way that he imagines freeing his son, right? He builds the wings from the same conceptual blueprints that he built the labyrinth. And so he looks at Icarus, for me, right, and he says, fly straight, don't fly too high or too low. But that sort of is to miss the point, that his flight is doomed from the moment he took that leap, right, the Phanonian leap, because it wasn't one that was open to flight and the inventiveness of flight. It was a strictly defined formula. And so really the flight path is an extension of the labyrinth. And that's what I want to avoid in our imagination of Black flight and of Black study, is creating a formula that really becomes nothing but, as Fanon would say, a nauseating mimicry of Europe.
Great. And maybe this is, maybe you have already answered my last question here then, which is, whatever the future that Black studies has in an institutional context, which is hopefully a long one. But in the context of the study of Black life and the field of Black studies, what is the issue you would want us all to be thinking about, or the question you would want us all to be asking?
So thinking about this question, and so in the opening of Black Skin, White Masks, very opening of it, Fanon says something like, don't expect any explosion today. It's too early or too late. And so I would say that in that quote, Fanon positions us in the twilight between the anti-Black world and what could come before it, right? I call this the twilight of the icons. It's also sort of a nod to Nietzsche. And I think what's happening here is like, we are unsure of what comes next, whether we're preparing for dusk or for dawn, right? Dusk being the re-intensification of all of these violent things and the lack of opportunity to resist in some sense that is symbolized by the Trump administration, or dawn, right? The opening of space for radical invention, for something new. And so from that liminal position, I continue to wonder personally, and this is to say that I hope that we all can collectively wonder as practitioners of Black study, is it too early? Have we not yet opened space for the conditions for a decolonial movement to end the anti-Black world? Or is it too late? Has this generation of scholars and activists already failed by allowing this iteration of the Black liberation struggle to become distorted into another icon? And how do we proceed in the wake of the scandals that have engulfed the Black Lives Matter movement and this iteration? And so I don't think that any of us individually will produce that answer on our own. I think instead it requires an orientation toward the messiness of lived experience, toward the polyvalent flows of Black radical thought and activism. It is to recognize that we will slip up, we will flinch, um, but how do we orient ourselves toward a process of constant, humble self-reflection about our continued harmful attachments to the anti-Black world? And I think in that reflection, that continual interrogation, holding our own feet to the fire, that's where we can get rid of those attachments and open that space. And as I mentioned, as I'm working on this second book project now, I really am thinking about this idea of the world is creolizing or archipelagizing via glissant, and what that means. How do we connect these disparate struggles? What does Black study offer for the various disparate oppressed communities across the globe? How can we learn from these other oppressed communities? And how can we really connect ourselves in this sort of international or intercommunal struggle? All right, so that I'm thinking now, like, what are the possibilities for errantry and anti-system thought when thinking Blackness and Roma-ness together, for example? That might be a specific version of a larger question around disorder and creating coalitions that are not parasitic, but are indeed towards the end of this anti-Black world, which is anti so many other people. How do we get a critical movement that is not looking to get its piece of the pie in this world, but really something that is actually much different that we've never imagined before?
That's just a really wonderful place to end. I love that formulation. Thank you for that. That was had real depth to it and real clarity to it. That's fantastic. Thank you. And just generally, this has been such a fantastic conversation. I loved it. I was looking forward to it, and it's really just been so good. So thank you for your time. I mean, I appreciate that. Everybody's busy. We all have jobs and personal lives and all that. But really, thank you for your thoughtfulness in this. I think you've raised so many questions for everyone who listens to this, and this is really a valuable contribution to the series. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm just honored to participate in it, and I'm a fan of the work that you all are doing with the podcast, and your scholarship, of course, as well. And so, really grateful to have been invited, and thank you for the conversation and the really provocative questions.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks so much. I'll pass that on to Ashley. I know, we do this because we really want to and we really love it, but we also, hope that it asks questions that make people think, but also that in listening, we start to think about our shared field and our shared struggles in new and important ways. So you've really helped with that. I appreciate it. And have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you as well. Have a good one.
All right. Take care.
Bye bye.